Okay, so today we are going to do a video on what is perhaps my most requested topic, the flags of the provinces of Canada. Yes, this is truly a channel for cool dudes. Now, to even begin broaching this very rich and deep topic, which would probably require about 18 videos to explain in full, we must begin with some Canadian flag history. In the old days, Canada was a colony of Great Britain, and it was assumed that the only flag you needed in a British colony was the good old Union Jack. But the British themselves eventually needed to come up with a way to tell all of their colonies apart. So the people in the British Colonies Department came up with a universal template for colonial flag design. It was called an ensign and was based on the kind of flag that they used for the different divisions of the British Navy. A colonial ensign flag would be either red, white, or blue with a Union Jack in the top left corner, and in the bottom right corner would be the coat of arms of that particular colony. So eventually the colony of Canada got one of these flags, and as the years went on, it eventually became more popular and famous. Throughout the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, as Canada became more politically independent from Great Britain, the Union Jack started to be seen less and less, and the Canadian ensign started to be used more and more as a symbol of Canada's status as a separate country. But there was an obvious contradiction here. Why was Canada demonstrating its independence by using a colonial flag? In 1965, the colonial flag was officially ditched, and the Canadian flag that we all know and love today, the maple leaf, was officially adopted. So what does this have to do with provincial flags? Well, basically this exact same story panned out in all of Canada's provinces. Like Canada itself, all of the Canadian provinces had colonial ensign flags too, with the Union Jack in one corner and the provincial coat of arms in the other. These flags were all much more obscure than the red ensign flag though. In the early days, people just really didn't care that much about having flags for provinces. Truly a backwards time. The first Canadian province to think about making a new style of flag was Nova Scotia. Now pay attention here, because what Nova Scotia did basically set the trend for all other Canadian provincial flags. So the Nova Scotians had a provincial coat of arms that looked like this. And then in the 1920s, around the time when Nova Scotia was celebrating the 300th anniversary of its founding, someone in Nova Scotia was like, hey, why don't we make a new Nova Scotia flag to celebrate? And someone else was like, hey, yeah, why don't we just stretch out the provincial coat of arms and make that the flag? And so that's what they did. They took the provincial coat of arms and stretched it into a rectangle, and that became the flag of Nova Scotia. Then nothing happened for a really long time until the 1960s, when there was all this hubbub about changing the Canadian colonial ensign flag into something new and more interesting. This inspired a lot of the Canadian provinces to get interested in changing their flags too. It helped that Canada's 100th birthday was coming up in 1967, so a lot of the provinces wanted to have something cool to fly by then. In 1960, British Columbia took their coat of arms and stretched it into a flag. They were followed by Prince Edward Island in 1964 and New Brunswick in 1965. Alberta was even lazier. All they did was get rid of the Union Jack on theirs. Saskatchewan was a little bit more creative. They created a flag that was clearly inspired by their coat of arms, but was not simply a stretched out version of it. But just to be sure everyone got the message, they also stuck the coat of arms on it as well. Now see, the Canadian government's decision to get rid of the colonial ensign flag and adopt the maple leaf flag was not without controversy. There were a lot of people who thought this was a great betrayal of Canadian history. There has always been a sizable chunk of Canadians, even today, who are really into celebrating Canada's history as a British colony and really opposed to the threatening of any symbols from that era. This is largely an anti-American thing, but that is a topic for another day. Anyway, during this big Canada-wide flag-changing fad, a few of the more conservative-minded leaders of the Canadian provincial governments very ostentatiously refused to play along. In 1965 and 1966, the provincial governments of Manitoba and Ontario passed special laws to keep their British-style flags, and those flags are still in use to this day. In Newfoundland, their government went even further and said only the full Union Jack would be recognized as the official provincial flag. It wasn't until 1980 that Newfoundland formally gave this up and adopted this as their official flag instead, which, as you can see, is still pretty Union Jacky. The only province I haven't mentioned so far is Quebec, Canada's French-speaking province. As usual, Quebec was off doing its own thing and doesn't really fit into the larger Canadian story. Quebecers have had a famed aversion to British symbols for ages, which only makes sense since a lot of them are still sore about being conquered by the British Empire. This red, white, and green flag used to be a popular Quebec patriotic symbol in the old days, but was eventually phased out for not being French enough, possibly because it was the flag of Hungary. So in 1948, the Quebec government made a new flag. It was designed to look like the sort of flags that the French Empire had flown in colonial North America. It's actually quite an interesting flag in the sense that nothing on it has any official symbolism. It's just supposed to look French. But that's also the story of the maple leaf flag. It doesn't have any official symbolism either. It's just supposed to look Canadian. So what do you think? Do you think the Canadian provincial flags are any good? They sometimes get credit for being visually interesting, but as you can see, most of them were pretty lazily designed. If you want to know the story of the symbolism, you really have to look at the stories of the symbolism of the coat of arms, since they're kind of inseparable. In recent years, there's been some growing interest in perhaps simplifying some of the provincial flag designs. Would that be a good idea? Let me know. That's all for this week. See you soon.